December 25th, 1991. The Soviet hammer and sickle is lowered over the Kremlin, marking the end of a decades-long geopolitical conflict and ushering in an era of unchallenged American hegemony. Some made predictions that the Euro-American model of political liberalism and economic capitalism would last forever. 3 turbulent decades later, and it has become clear that the collapse of a multipolar globe is not the end of history, just the end of a world order. A rising China, the undermining of American dollar supremacy, the flagrant disregard of international norms and laws by American allies and enemies, all cracks in the once ironclad perception of American sole superpower status. And as the facade of American domination begins to fade, so does the narrative of American exceptionalism. It is difficult to convince the world of your unique worthiness when your infrastructure is falling apart and healthcare costs the arm and leg you needed surgery for in the first place. Those who take the position that the American empire will decline are always going to end up being right. The internet mantra, nothing ever happens, will always be beaten out by nothing lasts forever given a long enough timeline. And while I do not believe the collapse of America itself is imminent, I think we are moving to a world where America is unable to project its exclusive will across the globe. And when looking at how this might happen, I think there's no better example to look at than the empire America spent decades locked in competition with. Another modern, multi-ethnic, global behemoth with a network of alliances and a truly international economy. I am, of course, talking about the Soviet Union. So hop into your time machine and set the date to 1989. Pour yourself a shot of vodka or an age-appropriate substitute and prepare yourself to peek behind the Iron Curtain to witness the most recent seismic shift in global politics. Military intervention against Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan leading to a costly and embarrassing defeat. Bioweapon leaks and other man-made horrors beyond your comprehension. Industrial catastrophes that make swaths of land unlivable for decades to come. A constant increase in military resources fueled by paranoia of geopolitical rivals. Increasing ethnic tension among citizens. A stagnating economy which is unable to provide material gains to a large portion of the population. The Soviet Union was dealing with a lot in the decade leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989. And while the iconic images of the wall being torn apart are often used as a symbol for Soviet dissolution, the moment was little more than a blip in a massive tapestry of regrettable decisions and foreign pressures. And much like the tapestry of regrettable decisions that comprise your own life, it is hard to pinpoint the exact moment things started going downhill. That being said, there is one force which would have an outsized influence on and interconnection with the many emerging crises of the later Soviet era.
It's the economy, stupid. Okay?
In the West, we tend to conceptualize the Soviet Union as an impoverished cautionary tale about the perils of communism. This is understandable because despite having free post-secondary education, universal healthcare, and heavily subsidized housing, it did not have nearly as many flavors of ice cream or brands of deodorant.
Piece of power, you a superpower!
Despite its reputation, the Soviet economy was a well-oiled machine which managed to rapidly industrialize a feudal backwater into an industrial state. That being said, the Soviet economy was not without fault which played a large role in the collapse of the socialist empire. Economies are a bit like willies. To perform effectively, you are going to want an increase of size. When they stagnate, or God forbid shrink, it is going to cause a great deal of anxiety. Well, luckily, the Soviet economy grew, and grew, and grew until 1975. The Soviet economy stagnated for a near decade between 1975 and 1984. Embarrassing, but leadership had a plan. They turned on the money machine and it went burr. Why confront core economic issues when you could just print more money? This would not be the worst strategy in the world if the Soviet economy immediately rebounded and went back to booming growth, but it did not. Alas, the money printer was left on, and the economy continued to stagnate, adding inflation to the growing list of Soviet economic crises. Then 1985 hit.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев?
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть писахат.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union. By the time Gorbachev assumed office, the economy of the Soviet Union was rebounding. The near decade of stagnation was done and things were looking up. So what did Gorbachev decide to do? If you guess mandating radical changes to the Soviet economy points to you. By 1986, Gorbachev had coined the term perestroika to describe his economic and political reforms. Perestroika sought to gradually liberalize the Soviet economy and open it up to limited foreign capital. He paired this with glasnost, an agenda which sought to increase the transparency and openness of the Soviet government. Some in the West misconstrue this to mean he wanted to transition the Soviet Union away from socialism. This isn't true. What Gorbachev wanted to do was transition the Soviet Union into a market economy. He wanted state capital to be gradually transferred to worker cooperatives. These worker cooperatives would be responsible for their own capital and assets, they would pay their own wages, and they would compete with each other. The workers owned the means of production while supply and demand governed distribution. Exciting, right? Unfortunately, it didn't do much to help the Soviet economy. That's already not an ideal predicament. It was made worse by glasnost. Now the media was able to criticize Gorbachev and all his economic mediocrity, and criticize is exactly what they did. I'm personally for a free media, but if I were the head of an authoritarian socialist state, I might liberalize the media after I had already implemented my drastic economic and political reforms. Unfortunately for the Soviets, I was not heading their state, which, if anything, is the real reason behind their collapse. Moving back to Gorbachev, by 1989, the Soviet economy began to nosedive. The willy was getting smaller, and the anxiety over stagnation had quickly turned into full-blown panic. Add to this the introduction of multiple parties into legislative branches of government, and you have the geopolitical equivalent of opening up your marriage immediately after getting an ED diagnosis. The Soviet government was running deficit after deficit, and the aforementioned inflation was hitting the population harder than ever. Turmoil. But the greatest economic turmoil of all would happen immediately after the Soviet collapse. America would pump the country full of capital and strip its assets for parts. No matter how bad your economy is, it will be far worse once the American elite get their hands on it. Speaking of America, let's take a look at the state of their economy. While the Soviets had a socialist dumpster fire of an economy, the US has a capitalist dumpster fire of an economy. Is economic growth stagnating? No, the green line is still going up. You know what is stagnating though? Wage growth. Since 1979, the productivity of American workers has skyrocketed, all of this while real wage growth is basically flatlined. Part of the reason the Soviet Union ran their money printers was to make sure workers get their guaranteed wage increases. The Americans use their money printer just as liberally, but they use it to bail out oligarchs, day traders, and corporate entities. Just like the Soviet Union, this causes inflation, but in the United States that inflation tends to strip back any material gains that the working class have made. Housing has become unaffordable. Even the lucky Americans with decent jobs can't afford to buy property in more desirable metro areas. For those who don't have decent jobs, good luck affording rent for a one-bedroom apartment. But America does have upsides. You can finance everything from cell phone to an Uber Eats purchase. If you can't finance it in-house, you can use a credit card. Only in the modern West can a government and its citizens experience a debt crisis simultaneously. The national debt crisis is fueled by repeated deficits, another commonality with the Soviets. So what could these superpowers be spending so much money on? Turns out the answer is literal death machines. Nuclear warheads and fighter jets aren't cheap, and neither are the silos, submarines, carrier fleets, and airfields that host them. You cannot be an international contender without a military that can project some serious force. And to project serious force, you need a manufacturing, research, and support base. This is where the military-industrial complex comes in. In the Soviet Union, a lot of resources were allocated towards building an arsenal capable of confrontation with the US. Those resources created jobs which were dependent on the continued manufacturing of weapons for the Soviets and their allies. Luckily for the tapestry of organizations that sought to turn the means of production into means of destruction, there was an eternal enemy to one-up, fight a proxy war against, or scare: the Americans. In the United States, the military-industrial complex comes in the form of corporations, a lot of them, all vying for contracts by lobbying contacts in Washington, D.C. What creates contracts? War. It doesn't have to be an American war either. Any war involving an American ally or enemy can be lucrative. The Americans will arm anyone from the 911 guys to Ukraine if it thinks that will further their geopolitical interests. A coup happens in Thailand and some dude in Seattle gets another zero added to his bank account. The world is a dangerous place. Boeing and Raytheon are here to provide the stealth bombers and Javelin missiles required to make it safer. What do you get when a huge number of jobs and capital are tied up in the growth of your defense industry? An incentive structure so perverse it would make your search history blush. The annual defense budget in the United States is nearing $1 trillion. For reference, that is more than China, Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdoms, and Germany combined. The Soviet Union was officially spending around 5% of their GDP on defense before its collapse. America is currently at 3.4%. With defense budgets bigger than queso,
Poutine.
you would expect operational excellence. Not quite. Both countries somehow managed to lose year-long wars to ragtag Islamist militias in Afghanistan. For the Soviets, the war in Afghanistan was an expensive and unpopular quagmire that brought the nation's ability to project power into question and contributed to their imperial collapse. For the Americans, it was an expensive and unpopular quagmire that brought the nation's ability to project power into question and may contribute to their imperial collapse. Unpopular wars aren't the only things that lead empires to rubble. State cover-ups of infectious diseases leaking out of labs tends to undermine faith in government institutions. The Soviets learned this valuable lesson in statecraft when people in Sverdlovsk started falling violently ill from anthrax. Sverdlovsk was home to the Scientific Institute of Bacterial Vaccine Preparation, a facility which focused on studying a bacteria which caused anthrax. The Soviet government sent people to analyze the situation and concluded that the cause of the anthrax was contaminated meat. I'm no medical expert, but it seems suspicious that the city's anthrax lab was immediately ruled out as a place of origin. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian government would admit that the anthrax outbreak originated from the lab and that the Soviet government tried to cover it up by claiming tainted meat caused the disease. There is a very obvious recent parallel to this that I don't want to elaborate on because it's still heavily censored and somewhat taboo, but I'm sure you can fill in the blanks. Lab leaks were not the only thing that the Soviets covered up, though. They also covered up industrial disasters. In 1986, a nuclear reactor at a power plant in Chernobyl would catch fire after a low-power test. This fire would kill several workers at the plant, but the radioactive material spewing out of the plant would impact many more in the surrounding area. The Soviet government shared a burden of responsibility for this disaster because they had the plant staffed with undertrained engineers and they had neglected to perform maintenance and safety checks. This kind of incident was supposed to be impossible. Given the large population surrounding the facility, one would assume that the government would be rushing to inform citizens and evacuate them. Instead, the Soviet government downplayed and denied the disaster for 3 days after the incident. Thousands of cancer cases and other deaths have been attributed to Chernobyl and the cleanup afterwards. One would assume that the American government would look at this disaster and learn it is best to confront these things head on. Unfortunately, they did not. From Flint, Michigan to East Palestine, Ohio, the American authorities have a tendency to downplay or outright deny disasters that they can be held liable for. In both the Soviet Union and the United States, this has the effect of eroding citizens' trust in their government. I'm not sure what the ideal state reaction to industrial catastrophe is, but it cannot be the pro-Smash player caught up in a grooming scandal routine both the Soviets and Americans employed. Speaking of gamers, racism. America has a racism problem. If you're the kind of person who goes outside, you are unlikely to encounter open racism on a day-to-day basis. Open racism has fallen wildly out of fashion since the late 60s, and for good reason. That being said, racists are still among us. Some have learned to conceal their prejudice, others wear it on their sleeves. Individual racists aren't the only problem, though. The institutions are corrupted by their own history. From genocide to slavery, head taxes to segregation, if there was a bingo card for racial discrimination, the United States wouldn't need the free space. This history does not exist in a vacuum. It is Americana. It corrupts institutions, social norms, and politics to this day. Similar to class contradictions, ethnic tension can tear societies apart. Though I think America has evolved a lot since the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, I am unsure if open racism will remain taboo in the eyes of the public going forward. If explicitly racist policy becomes mainstreamed again, it is my opinion that it will be an existential threat to the American project. Ethnic tension was also a pervasive issue in the Soviet Union, but in a very different way. In America, the state hates minorities. In Soviet Russia, minorities hate the state. The Soviet Union operated more as a centralized federation of republics than a single nation. These republics were guaranteed language rights, civic equality, and partial autonomy, but were all outnumbered by a Slavic, Russian-speaking majority. Add to this religious and cultural differences amongst the republics, and you basically have a primordial soup for nationalism. The national question would become a source of tension within the Union and acted as a driving force behind Soviet collapse. Starting with Lithuania in 1990, republics started leaving the Union until its formal dissolution in 1991. A house divided against itself cannot stand is a quote from the Bible that Abraham Lincoln used to highlight the effects of national division over slavery. I love this quote because I think it highlights the ways empires actually collapse. It is rarely just external pressures or a single bad decision, but instead a mess of divisions, contradictions, blunders, and bloat that eventually erode faith in imperial institutions and authority. I've spent this video building up the case that the American hegemony is in its twilight years, but I don't necessarily think that is a bad thing. Empires can and do coexist, and American sole superpower status hasn't exactly ushered in a Pax Americana or improved the lives of the American people. America is in a unique position to accept that other contenders will rise and try to coexist with them. A rising China does not mean there has to be another Cold War. A unipolar world is not something divinely ordained, it is an exception to a norm. America may not be able to project its exclusive will across the globe for much longer, but they will still have a seat at the table. A seat at the table is much less expensive than a throne in a castle. Maybe those extra resources can go to dealing with the constant internal crises which plague the United States. Or maybe history is doomed to repeat itself, and we will find ourselves in another existential battle against an ideological adversary with a garnish of potential Armageddon. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please like, subscribe, and feel free to leave suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching.